The institution of slavery in the United States is often associated with the brutal labor forced upon African Americans in cotton fields and other plantations. However, one of the most harrowing and lesser-known aspects of slavery was the existence of breeding farms. These were places where enslaved women were forced to bear children, who were then sold into slavery. This practice, rooted in the dehumanization and commodification of black bodies, reveals the horrifying depths to which slaveholders would sink to maintain and expand their labor force. Before we proceed, please take few seconds and click the subscribe button to join this community. The concept of breeding enslaved people arose out of economic necessity and the desire to perpetuate the institution of slavery. The Transatlantic Slave Trade was banned in 1808, cutting off the supply of enslaved Africans. Slaveholders in the southern United States faced a dwindling labor force and turned to a horrifying solution: breeding their enslaved population. Virginia and Maryland, where tobacco plantations were once predominant, became significant centers for this practice. As tobacco farming became less profitable, plantation owners began to sell enslaved people downriver to the Deep South, where the demand for labor was still high due to the expanding cotton economy. The idea of breeding farms was seen as a way to sustain the supply of enslaved laborers without relying on the now illegal international trade. One of the most notorious breeding farms was located in Richmond, Virginia, operated by Robert Lumpkin, a prominent slave trader. Lumpkin's jail, as it was known, was a place of terror where enslaved women were repeatedly raped to produce children who could be sold for profit. Lumpkin's breeding farm was a critical hub in the domestic slave trade, sending thousands of enslaved people to the Deep South. Primary sources from the period, such as letters and sale records, provide a glimpse into the brutal efficiency of this operation. Another infamous breeding farm was in Maryland, run by the Brodess family. This farm was particularly notorious for its systematic approach to breeding. Enslaved women were forced to have as many children as possible, with the understanding that their children would be sold as soon as they were old enough to work. The Brodess farm, like many others, contributed to the growth of the slave population in the United States, particularly in the cotton-rich Deep South. The operations of breeding farms were carefully calculated to maximize profit. Enslaved women, often selected for their physical health and fertility, were paired with enslaved men who were also chosen for their physical traits. These forced pairings were not based on any human relationship or connection. The enslaved were treated as livestock, with their bodies being used as tools for production. In these breeding farms, male slaves were expected to impregnate multiple women each year. Those who failed to meet the required quota were often punished, sometimes even castrated. This dehumanizing practice reduced these men to mere breeders, stripping them of their dignity and humanity. One particularly brutal example involved a slave named James, who was forced to father over 20 children before he reached the age of 30. James was frequently moved between different plantations to maximize his reproductive output, a common practice among breeding farms. The psychological and physical toll on enslaved women was immense. They were forced to bear children under the constant threat of violence. Many accounts describe how women who did not produce children quickly enough or who resisted the breeding process were beaten, starved, or sold away from their families. The children born from these unions were often sold at auction as soon as they reached an age where they could be separated from their mothers, further perpetuating the cycle of trauma. The role of the state in the perpetuation of breeding farms cannot be overlooked. State laws in the South supported the practice by defining enslaved people as property and codifying the status of children born to enslaved mothers as slaves. This legal framework ensured that the offspring of enslaved women would be bound to a life of servitude, providing a steady supply of labor for the agricultural economy. In Virginia, for example, laws were enacted that encouraged the breeding of enslaved people by granting slaveholders ownership of any children born to enslaved women. This legal codification of slavery as a hereditary condition cemented the practice of breeding farms, as it provided a legal basis for the sale and exploitation of children born into slavery. The impact of breeding farms on the enslaved population was devastating. Families were routinely torn apart as children were sold away from their mothers, often to plantations hundreds of miles away. The trauma of these separations was profound, with many enslaved people carrying the scars of these experiences for the rest of their lives. Breeding farms also reinforced the dehumanization of black people, reducing them to mere commodities to be bought, sold, and bred for profit. The practice contributed to the entrenchment of racist ideologies that viewed African Americans as inherently inferior and suited only for servitude. These beliefs would persist long after the abolition of slavery, influencing the systemic racism that continues to affect black Americans today. Several primary sources provide insight into the operation of breeding farms and the experiences of those who endured them. The diary of Mary Chesnut, a southern plantation mistress, offers a chilling account of the practice. Chesnut wrote about the forced breeding of enslaved women on plantations, describing how slaveholders would encourage or force women to bear children to increase their workforce. Another primary source is the autobiography of Harriet Jacobs, an escaped slave who wrote under the pseudonym Linda Brent. In her book, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, Jacobs described the constant pressure on enslaved women to bear children and the sexual exploitation they endured. Jacobs's account provides a personal and poignant perspective on the horrors of breeding farms, highlighting the resilience of those who survived them. The humiliation and emasculation that came with sexual abuse often led to long-term psychological scars. Some victims became withdrawn, while others developed deep-seated anger and resentment that could manifest in acts of rebellion or violence. However, the fear of further abuse often kept these feelings suppressed, trapping the victims in a state of perpetual fear and subjugation. The end of the Civil War and the abolition of slavery in 1865 brought an end to the breeding farms. However, the legacy of these farms continued to shape the lives of African Americans long after emancipation. The trauma inflicted by these practices left deep scars on the black community, contributing to the social and economic challenges faced by formerly enslaved people and their descendants. Breeding farms during slavery represent one of the darkest aspects of American history. These farms were not just places of forced labor, but also sites of systematic sexual exploitation and dehumanization. The practice of breeding enslaved people to sustain the institution of slavery reflects the lengths to which slaveholders would go to maintain their power and profit. As we reflect on this history, it is essential to remember the resilience and strength of those who endured these atrocities. Their stories remind us of the enduring impact of slavery and the importance of confronting and understanding this painful past. Only by acknowledging the full extent of the horrors of slavery, including the practice of breeding farms, can we begin to address the legacies of racism and inequality that continue to shape our society today. Please like, share and subscribe to this channel for more of Global Insights.